Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm so glad you're here. Tonight, we begin with a bone-chilling tale called Endless Fell. Get comfortable, but don't get too relaxed. This one might just keep you up at night. The first time I dreamt of the baseball field, I thought nothing of it. A simple, empty expanse, a lonely diamond beneath an unnatural red sky. The grass was always wet, clinging to my shoes with a damp persistence that never faded. The air had a metallic taste, like rusted iron filling my lungs with each breath. But the strangest part, the part that gnawed at my sanity, was the ball. No matter how hard I swung, no matter how cream the hit, it never landed. It simply vanished, swallowed by the horizon. At first, the dream came every few weeks. Then, every few nights. Then, every night. I never told anyone. Who would care? Who would understand? A dream is just a dream. But it felt different. The kind of different that makes your skin crawl in the dark, that makes you doubt the safety of the waking world. And then, one night, I heard the cheering. It was a hollow, soundless kind of applause. The kind you feel more than you hear. I turned toward the bleachers, and there they were, figures, faceless and tall, their bodies shifting like smoke caught in a draft. Their hands clapped in eerie synchronization, though there was no sound. The pitcher's mound was empty. The gun, a bull, sudden and fast, hurling straight at me. I'd barely had time to react, but I swung. I missed. The crowd fell silent. Then they stood up. I woke up, my chest heaving, drenched in sweat. Relief hit me first, then confusion. My feet were wet. I could feel the cold moisture soaking into my socks. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, heart hammering. My shoes were caked in mud. Outside my window, in the dead silence of the night, I heard it. The distant, rhythmic sound of a baseball bouncing against the ground. I didn't move. I couldn't. My muscles locked as the noise grew closer, bouncing, rolling, stopping. Right beneath my window, something inside me whispered not to look. That whatever was out there wasn't meant to be seen. But the compulsion was stronger. My body betrayed me. I pulled back the curtain. The baseball sat there, perfectly still, a faint steam rising from its surface as though it had been burning through the air just seconds ago. My breath hitched. The dirt clinging to it matched the filth on my shears. I slammed the curtain shut. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next night, I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe I walked through some damp grass before bed and didn't remember. Maybe the baseball had been there all along. Maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. But when I finally drifted into sleep, I was back on the field. The sky was darker now, the red tint bleeding into something deeper, something hungry. The figures in the bleachers were already standing, waiting. Their hands twitched at their sides, as though eager to move. The ball came again. I didn't sling this time. It hit the ground with a sickening, wet splash. Not the sound of leather on dirt, but something else. Something organic. The figures started to move. Not toward me. Not yet. Instead, they pointed. I followed their gesture, my gaze shifting toward the dugout. A door stood there, one I had never seen before. A heavy iron thing, rusted and ancient, embedded into the earth. It was slightly ajar. From within, something breathed. The dream ended with the door creaking open. When I woke up, I could still hear it. The third night. I didn't want to sleep. I fought it with everything I had, caffeine, music, anything to keep my eyes from closing. But exhaustion is cruel, and eventually I lost. This time, the field was different. The bases were gone. The pitcher's mound was nothing more than a gaping hole in the ground, dark and endless. The figures in the bleachers were closer. Their arms were longer now, stretching unnaturally toward the field. The iron door was wide open. Something was coming. I tried to wake up. I screamed. I forced my fingers into my arms, digging my nails deep into my flesh, willing the pain to snap me out of it. But it didn't work. A sound echoed from the hole in the pitcher's mound. A wet, dragging sound. The figures turned their heads, slow, deliberate, their movements impossibly synchronized. Their eyeless faces locked onto me. Then I felt it. The breath on my neck. The fourth night. I don't remember waking up. I don't remember going outside. But when I came to, I was standing in my backyard, staring at a baseball on the grass. It was wet. I picked it up. It was warm. And then I heard the cheering. It wasn't a dream anymore. The final night. I didn't sleep. Not because I didn't want to. Because I couldn't. Every time I blinked, I was there. Even awake, I could hear them, feel the damp air pressing against my skin, taste the rust in my mouth. The door in the field was open, and whatever had been waiting inside had stepped out. There wasn't just a dream anymore. It never had been. I don't know what happens next, but I can hear the ball. It's bouncing again. Closer and closer. And this time, I don't think I'll wake up. Hope you liked that one. Now, let's move on to our next creepy tale. You married the wrong one. Get ready. The living room was dim, bathed in the soft glow of the television screen. Mark leaned back in his armchair, a glass of whiskey resting in his hand, half empty but forgotten. The wedding video played in front of him, the familiar warmth of nostalgia settling in his chest. There they were, him and Claire. The happiest day of his life. Laughter echoed through the speakers, the gentle murmur of guests blending with the soft notes of the piano. Claire's smile was radiant, her white dress flowing like water as she glided across the screen. Their vows, their first dance, the way she looked at him with a love so pure it made his heart ache. Mark exhaled deeply, a sad smile pulling at his lips. Claire had been gone for over a year now. A sudden accident, a freak occurrence that ripped her away from him too soon. The video was all he had left of her. As the final frame faded to black, the hum of static filled the silence. Mark's eyelids grew heavy. The warmth of the whiskey, the exhaustion of grief, sleep crept in, pulling him under. And then he was watching again. The same wedding video. But something was wrong. At first, it was subtle. The guests in the background weren't moving as they should. Their faces blurred, smudged, shifting like smeared paint. The music played backward, a slow, guttural distortion crawling through the air. Then Claire appeared. Only it wasn't Claire. She walked down the aisle, but something in her movements felt unnatural, jerky, stiff, like a marionette on tangled strings. The veil concealed her face, and Mark's stomach twisted as an inexplicable dread curled around his spine. He wanted to wake up. He needed to wake up. But he couldn't move. The bride reached the altar. Slowly, she lifted her veil. It wasn't Claire. The woman's face was unfamiliar, yet horrifyingly wrong. Her eyes black, hollow voids. Her mouth stretched too wide, a jagged grin splitting her pale skin. The corners of her lips bled as she smiled. She turned, looking directly into the camera, into him, and whispered, "You married the wrong one." A deafening silence swallowed the room. Mark bolted upright, gasping for air, his heart slamming against his ribs. Sweat drenched his skin, his hands trembling as he gripped the armrests of his chair. It was a dream. Just a dream. But the television was still on. The wedding video was paused. A cold, prickling unease crawled through him. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached for the remote, his fingers slick with sweat. He rewound the video. His breath caught in his throat. The guests, they weren't smiling anymore. Their faces, distorted, frozen in silent screams. Their eyes sunken pits of darkness, all staring directly at him. His blood turned to ice. The audio, no longer cheerful, no longer filled with laughter, had changed. A faint whisper threaded through the static, barely audible, a voice flittering into his ears. Wrong one. Mark threw the remote, his pulse roaring in his ears. The television flickered, the image woken, twisting. The screen darkened. A new scene appeared, the wedding, but different. The altar was abandoned, the guests gone. The chairs overturned, the walls smeared with something dark. The air felt thick, suffocating, pressing against his chest. And then, the bride stepped forward. The same hollow eyes, the same twisted grin. She was closer now. Too close. Mark scrambled back, his breath ragged. He wanted to turn off the TV, to run, to do anything, but his body refused to move. The woman leaned in. Her face filled the screen. Her lips parted, revealing teeth too sharp, too jagged. Her voice crawled out, thick with something ancient, something wrong. "You should have been mine." The screen shattered. A blast of static erupted from the speakers, the television convulsing with distorted images. Mark threw himself backward, crashing to the floor. Silence. The screen was black, but the reflection, in the shattered glass, showed a woman standing behind him. A veil of white, eyes of endless void, and a mouth stretching wider. Too wide, too hungry. A cold breath brushed his neck. Mime. Mark's scream never made it off. Wow, that last one gave me goosebumps. But we're not stopping there. Up next is our third terrifying tale of the night. The man in the screen. Let's see if you can handle this one. The remote clicked dully in James's hand, his tired eyes scanning channel after channel of late-night garbage. Infomercials, static, reruns of sitcoms he had never liked. He sighed, shifting in his recliner, letting the blue glow of the screen wash over him. Then, the screen flickered. No title, no network logo. Just a grainy, dimly lit room. A man sat in a chair, hunched slightly forward, his face half hidden in the shadows. James squinted. Something about the figure was unsettling. The man's posture, the way his head tilted ever so slightly. It was familiar. Too familiar. James shifted in his seat. The man on screen did the same. A chill slithered down his spine. James lifted his hand hesitantly. The figure mirrored him. He rubbed his face. The figure did too. A slow, crawling dread spread through his gut as he watched himself, his exact movements, being reflected back at him from the screen. But this wasn't a reflection. It was a recording. He was watching himself. Every breath, every twitch, exactly the same. The air in the room thickened, pressing against his chest. He reached for the remote, fingers clammy, pressing the channel button. Nothing. He pressed it again. And again. The scream didn't change. The man on screen didn't move. Then he did. But not in minute James. Slowly, the man on the screen lifted his head. His face was obscured, blurred around the edges like a corrupted video file. But James could feel the eyes locking onto him, seeing him. A voice, low, guttural, and layered, filled the room. "You shouldn't have watched." The screen cut to black. Silence. James sat frozen, remote still clenched in his hand, breath shallow. A long, dreadful moment passed. Then, with shaken fingers, he turned off the TV. The room felt wrong, like something was still here. Watching, the feeling clung to him long after he crawled into bed, pulling the covers over his body like a flimsy shield. His heart refused to slow. Every creak of his apartment sent fresh needles of fear down his spine. Sleep did not come easy. The next morning, James splashed cold water on his face, trying to shake the unease that had settled into his bones. Maybe it had been some elaborate prank, some glitch in the broadcast. Maybe he had imagined it, his over-tattered brain playing tricks on him. He glanced up and froze. The reflection in the mirror. It was slow, a fraction of a second behind. James lifted his hand. The reflection hesitated. Not much, just enough. His breath hitched. His stomach turned to ice. He stumbled back, knocking a bottle off the counter. The reflection copied him late. This wasn't a trick of the eyes. This was real. His shaking fingers reached for the mirror, pressing against the cold glass. His reflection did the same, delayed, as if, waiting for instructions. James tore himself away, heart hammering. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. But maybe it had always been like this. Maybe he had just never noticed. Right? He forced himself through his routine, trying to ignore the slight delay every time he caught his reflection. The rumness of it gnawed at him, but he shoved it aside. He had work, He had a normal life. This was nothing, nothing at all. That night, James hesitated before turning on the TV. The remote felt heavier in his hand, his thumb hovering over the power button. He shouldn't. He knew he shouldn't. But he did. The screen flickered to life, and the show was still playing. James's breast stopped. There he was, sitting in his recliner. But something was different. This time, the man on the screen wasn't copying him. He was ahead. James watched, frozen, as the version of himself on screen stood up. He remained seated. The screen James walked to the kitchen. James stayed in place, his pulse roaring in his ears. The version of him on screen reached for a knife James hadn't even considered touching. His mouth went dry. The screen flickered. Static crawled over the image, distorting it, but he could still see his other self turning around, looking directly at him. James's lens locked in place. A sharp, grating noise crawled from the speakers, a distortion of his own voice. "Get up." James remained frozen. The static worsened, the image twisting, his face working into something monstrous. The thing on screen smiled, a wide, splitting grin that tore too far up his cheeks. The distortion deepened. The static crackled. And then, the screen version of him stepped forward, out of frame. The TV was still on. The show was still playing. But his other self was no longer in it. The static fizzled. James's breath hitched. A noise soft, barely audible, rose behind him. A slow, deliberate breath, right at his ear. One step ahead. The lights flickered. James lunged for the remote, fingers slipping in panic, slamming the power button. The TV shut off. The apartment plunged into silence. But he wasn't alone. He could feel it. Something behind him. Something waiting. His body refused to move, his muscles frozen in place. A whisper low, teasing crawled into his ear. "You shouldn't have watched." The lights went out. James didn't have time to scream. You've made it this far, but can you handle one more? Our final story tonight is Nowhere on the Map. Let's go. The train cut through the night like a blade, its rhythmic clatter a lullaby against the silence of the sleeping passengers. Mai sat by the window, watching the darkened fields blur past, endless and empty. She wasn't supposed to be here. She had missed her original train, forced to take this late-night substitute. The route was unfamiliar, its path winding through forgotten landscapes, places untouched by the maps in her phone. Outside, the night stretched endlessly, until it didn't. A city rose from the darkness. It shouldn't have been there. Mara leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass. The skyline was unlike anything she had seen before, monolithic towers, impossibly tall, their surfaces shimmering with strange, pulsing lights. The architecture was a contradiction, both ancient and futuristic, a blend of forgotten eras and something not yet born. The mist swirled around the buildings, thick like smoke, shifting as if it were alive. Then, the train shuddered. The lights flickered. The motion slowed until it stopped completely. A crackling voice came over the intercom. "We're experiencing a brief delay for maintenance. Please remain seated." The announcement fizzled into static. Mara glanced around. No one reacted. No one moved. Then, she realized. No one was there at all. The seats, once occupied, were empty. The passengers gone. Not a single bag or jacket left behind. Her throat tightened. She stood, the silence pressing against her ears, thick and unnatural. "Hello?" Her voice barely carried through the car. No answer. The train door hissed open. Outside, the platform stretched before her, its tiled surface slick and reflecting the strange glow from the city beyond. She hesitated. Then, something shifted in the corner of her eye. A shadow darting between the platform pillars. Her breath hitched. She turned nothing. But the city was waiting. A soft hum vibrated through the air, deep and resonant, sinking into her bones. She stepped forward. The moment her foot touched the platform, The train doors slammed shut behind her with a final, metallic hiss. She spun around. The windows were black. The train was empty. And then, without a sound, it pulled away, vanishing into the darkness. She was alone. The city calls. The air was heavy, electric with something unseen. The buildings pulsed with an eerie light, casting long, shifting shadows onto the empty streets. There was no wind, no sound of insects, no distant traffic, just silence. And yet, she could feel something watching. The street stretched forward, lined with towering structures whose windows revealed nothing but darkness. Some of the buildings bore symbols she didn't recognize, carved into the stone like warnings. Others seemed impossibly smooth, as if they'd been grown rather than built. Mara took a step forward, then another. The hum in the air grew louder, thrumming beneath her skin. She turned a corner. A figure stood at the end of the street, tall, still, featureless. Her pulse slammed against her ribs. The figure didn't move. Then, another step. Not hers. She backed away. The figure mirrored her. The moment she blinked, it was closer. Mara's breath caught. She turned, heart hammering, and ran. The city twisted around her. Streets led nowhere, looping into themselves. The buildings seemed to shift when she wasn't looking, warping into different shapes, trapping her. Gun, she heard them. Footsteps. Not just one sound. Money. Soft at first, growing louder. Too many. They echoed from all directions. Something whispered. Not words, just sound, crawling into her ears, slithering through her thoughts. The street ahead stretched farther and farther away, as if pulling itself from her reach. She turned, and they were there. Figures, standing in the mist. No eyes, no faces, just shapes. Watching, waiting. Her legs locked. The whispering grew sharper, clawing at her mind. The figures moved. A slow, deliberate step forward. Mara gasped, stumbling back. The lights above flickered. The shadows stretched. The hum deepened, pressing against her skull. Her vision blurred. The city twisted. The buildings leaned toward her. The figures. Closer now. Reaching. The air turned thick, suffocating. A hand cold and wrong brushed her arm. She screamed. And then, silence. The last passenger. She woke with a jolt. The train rumbled beneath her. The seats were full. Passengers sat around her, heads resting against windows, the soft hum of motion filling the air. A dream. Just a dream. Mara exhaled shakily, running a hand over her face. Outside, the darkness stretched on. The city was gone. She let out a nervous laugh, shaking her head. Then, she noticed her hands. Her fingertips, dusted with fine, black ash. The train slowed. The intercom crackled. Next stop, the voice announced. The city's name was not on the map. And outside, in the distance, the buildings pulsed, waiting. And that wraps up tonight's stories. Thanks for hanging out with me. I love sharing these creepy tales of you. Make sure to come back tomorrow night for more spine-tingling horror. Until then, sleep well, if you dare.